Gamar Chatima Tova. I begin my words this evening with a poem that I found myself coming back to again and again in these past 7 months. It's called Talking to Grief by Denise Levertov. She writes, grief. I should not treat you like a homeless dog who comes to the back door for a crust, for a meatless bone. I should trust you. I should coax you into the house and give you your own corner, a worn mat to lie on, your own water dish. You think I don't know you've been living under my porch? You long for your real place to be ready before winter comes. You need your name, your collar and tag. You need the right to warn off intruders, to consider my house your own, and me your person, and yourself my own dog. On this Kol Nidre, I want, as Levertov so beautifully describes, to make space for to trust it and to welcome it like a companion. I want to create a sacred container for the loss and the grief that we have endured and are experiencing as a result of this pandemic. And while this conversation can be difficult and perhaps elicit feelings of preferring to keep that at the back door, I think it is especially important on Yom Kippur. As I said at the start of the service, Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre, and really all of Yom Kippur, we come before God and ourselves naked and without embellishment. For a precious 25 hours, we do not have to put on a happy face or keep slogging away at our day-to-day lives. We pause for a Shabbat Shabbaton, a complete cessation. We reflect, we repent, we tell the truth of our experience through prayer and silence, and also perhaps through tears. We share with God and ourselves what is in our heart and in our soul. Loss and grief have touched all of our lives in some way in the past year. Even for those who are lucky enough not to have lost someone directly through COVID, we are constantly aware of the senseless loss of life around us. It permeates our city and our country and our memories. I know that I can still hear the echo of the sirens on the street, even though it has abated. And there are so many personal losses and disappointments as well. And although not my focus this evening, there is no shortage of things for us to grieve beyond the pandemic. Impact of climate change, the erosion of democracy, just to name two of many. And if this were not enough, we lost Ruth Bader Ginsburg on Erev Rosh Hashanah, and many of us are still feeling the palpable grief of losing a superhero and also an extended member of the Jewish family. Yom Kippur is a sacred time we create, a sacred space we create with intention and time and prayer and love. And tonight, I want us to imagine Yom Kippur as this container that can hold our losses, help us make room for grief, and begin to help us find our way to healing. So to do that, I'm going to draw from Jewish rituals of grief and mourning and adapt them for our situation today. And just to be clear, this is an act of conscious reconstruction. I am taking the core ideas of these rituals and applying them not just to losses of human life, but all losses, including and perhaps especially those things taken from us as a result of the pandemic. So I'm going to talk through and move through 3 rituals, which I want us to reconstruct and think about for this moment that we're living in today. And they are kriya, which means tearing, but which I'm going to speak about tonight as naming our losses. Second, bechi, crying out or grieving our losses. The third, avelut, a time frame for mourning or mourning and letting go. So the first, kriya, tearing, naming our losses. The act of kriya, of tearing, is rooted in the Torah. When Jacob believes that his son Joseph was dead, he tore his garments. And the same is said of King David and his entourage when they heard of the deaths of Saul and Jonathan. The rabbis took what was a spontaneous expression of grief and ritualized it for future generations. But the ikar, the essential message, is the same. Acknowledge the loss. Recognize that something has shifted profoundly as a result. Those of you who have participated in kriya for a loved one have probably felt the power of that naming and the physical manifestation of our inward feelings, how powerful that act is. And as is often the case, Jewish wisdom here aligns with the psychology of grief. David Kessler, who's the co-author of the famous Stages of Grief theory, says that there is something so important and powerful about naming our grief because it helps us feel what is inside. So in that spirit, I want to take some time to name some of the losses that many of us have felt from this pandemic. And I acknowledge that it's not over, so we also have anticipatory feelings as well. Some of us have lost dear friends, family, and colleagues to COVID-19. Even those of us who did not have direct experiences are living with a backdrop of grief as we watch astounding numbers day after day. Many of us have loved ones who died from other causes, but because of COVID, we lost the opportunity to say a final goodbye, a hug, or offer a final holding of a hand. Many of us have lost jobs and income. Some of us are mourning entire industries that sustained us, but are now on hold or are no more. Some of us are in families where we may feel like we've lost some of our autonomy and our sense of selves outside of our family because we're home so much. And some of us are living alone and grieving the isolation that the pandemic engenders. Some of us miss celebrations for ourselves or our loved ones, postponed B'nai Mitzvah, no in-person proms, graduation, reunions, weddings, baby namings, etc. Some of us are grieving what we hoped would be the best years of our life, having retired or near retirement and finally ready to embrace this next stage. Some of us are feeling lost about vacations and travel. And while that might not seem like the highest priority, those trips might be what keeps us balanced or healthy and happy, and how we create meaningful memories with those we love. As New Yorkers, we mourn for what we love about the city that is on pause, or thankfully less on pause now, but many still are. Museums, orchestra, Broadway, to name a few. And for some of us, these are not flights of fancy. They are the core of our life, the heartbeat of our existence. I want to add in and share some of my own personal losses from this experience. I feel the loss that comes with the lack of physical contact outside of my family. It has been really painful to walk with SAJ members through grief or illness without holding their hand and offering a hug. I feel loss that we haven't seen our extended family members more than one time in 7 months. But mostly, I'm grieving the loss of innocence of my 9-year-old son, for the fact that his irrepressible love of life has been diminished. And in its place, there are fears and sadness that he does not have the words to articulate. And what should be great years for my 13-year-old, years of exploration and increased independence, are very isolated. And I'm so sad that as a mom, I can't make it better, not with hugs, love, or assurance. So at this point, I want to pause for a second and give you space to name something out loud or inside your mind that is true for you that I maybe have not mentioned, or just to simply sit with spaciousness around all that has been said. So just take a moment. Naming our losses helps us feel them, which helps us move through them, which helps us on the journey towards healing. So I've spoken about Kriya, reconstructed Kriya. Now I want to talk about Bechi, or crying out. In the Torah, when Abraham learns of his wife Sarah's death, he comes to Kiryat Arba, where she lays, and it says in the Torah that he lispod l'Sarah, the leave kota. He went to eulogize her and to cry for her, to wail for her. It's intriguing that the Torah does not include crying as part of the formal ritual, rather as its own act. In many places in Jewish sources, we see that crying out, bemoaning, and bewailing is not something to be afraid of, rather to be embraced and emulated. According to Rabbeinu Bachya, the Israelites were only redeemed because they cried out in unison, which, as he says, is to teach you that a person's prayer is only complete when that person cries out from the pain and stress that are contained within one's heart. A person's prayer is only complete when one cries out from the pain and stress that are contained in one's heart. Once we name the losses, we need to make space to grieve them, to cry out from the pain and stress. And while this sounds like a very powerful invitation, I recognize it is so hard to do sometimes, especially when we're talking about non-traditional losses or ambiguous loss, which is a term coined by Dr. Pauline Boss, for those losses which do not have closure or clear understanding, the losses that are more complicated or unresolved, which are basically all the losses we're talking about in the pandemic. We often diminish our losses and our pain because we know that so many people have it worse than us. We might say to ourselves, I still have my job, so I shouldn't complain about how hard things are. Or I'm healthy, so there's no reason to cry about something as silly as traveling with my family, or so on. In this very optimistic culture, it's hard enough for us to be seen in our overt losses, let alone those things that might be hidden from others. Yet the idea of crying out in Judaism is not contingent on the exact details of our personal situation or the sizing up of our pain and compared to other people. What if instead of denying our pain in favor of lifting up our blessings, we did both? We can be profoundly grateful that we are alive and knowing that it could have been otherwise, and we can be really sad that our life is so different than what we'd hoped and expected right now. We can feel close to our loved ones in our lives right now, and we can still bemoan the lack of freedom that comes from our situation. We can be appreciative of the gifts in our life and still lament for our kids and our grandchildren whose lives are forever impacted by this difficult time. So we don't cry for our own sake. We do so because being seen in our whole selves, both the positive and the negative, the joy and the pain, the light and the dark, is profoundly healing. So I invite you during the sacred container, which we have together, to find some time to hold both and to, as Rabbi Rabbeinu Bachya instructed, to allow for some crying out from the pain and stress that are contained in your heart. Spoken about naming our losses, crying out and grieving our losses. And now I want to talk about Avelut, a time frame, a mourning, and a letting go. As has been widely observed, Judaism's rituals of mourning demonstrate an intuitive understanding of the human psyche and the emotional needs of a mourner. Our ancestors designed a 7-day, 30-day, and 12-month cycle of grief and mourning that allows a person the physical and spiritual space to feel and act as a mourner. Reconstructing this idea for the grief we experienced through the pandemic, we can understand how important it is to give ourselves time and space to process what we're going through. And this is especially difficult to do in a pandemic when our new normal doesn't pause out of the stress that we are experiencing. So taking time and space for walks, for silence, for just feeling is critical to this period. But I think there is another really significant teaching here in this cycle of time. Our Judaism, our Jewish tradition teaches that there are beginnings and there are endings in this process. In fact, Judaism shuns excessive mourning, both those who go too far in their stringency and also those who go beyond the dates of which their mourning period exists. So I want to share a personal story to this point. It's a story from 20 years ago, but it feels like yesterday or 19 years ago. The year after my father died, I really gave myself permission to be a mourner. I cried all the time. I made sure everyone knew I was going through a really hard time. But I was really only able to recite Kaddish about 4 days a week, the mourner's Kaddish. I wish that I could do more, but I was commuting over 2 hours a day from my childhood home to live with my mother to rabbinical school. And I knew that the 11-month period of Kaddish was near. So one day I checked my calendar to see the exact date. Aghast, I looked and I saw that the last date I was supposed to say Kaddish was the next day. And I broke into tears. I went through all the stages. First, denial. How could this be? I was not ready for this to stop. This was not possible. Anger. So angry with myself for not keeping track of the time. Bargaining. Well, I could just keep going for a month, right? No one would fault me for saying Kaddish for another month. I mean, it's only a month. Depression. How could I go on? How could I say these words tomorrow? And this all happened within about a 10 to 15 minute span. Finally, I had a conversation with one of my professors, which led to acceptance. I realized in that conversation that Jewish tradition is wise and ancient. I need to lean into it, and I need to say my last daily Kaddish tomorrow. And when I did, something profound shifted in me. My grief did not end when I recited those words. My grief over my father is always with me. It ebbs and flows from periphery to center, but it is always there. but the mourning rituals needed to come to an end. There had to be a time when it was perfectly okay for me to be a mourner as a full-time job, and then there had to be a time when that was no longer the case. The finitude of the mourning contained me and held me, and also let me go. Yom Kippur, as I have stated, is a sacred container that we share and we shape together. We come to God and to ourselves this day naked, unadorned, unembellished. And I want to offer this Yom Kippur, this day, as a day where we can make space for grief. We can talk to grief, as the poet Denise Levertov said, as a companion, as a friend. A time in which we can allow ourselves to feel all that is in our hearts and minds. But to do that, we need to also know that this container is limited, that this container ends with Havdalah tomorrow night. Grief does not end. But God willing, we can utilize this time to feel and move through so that we are ready to hear the shofar's blast and to greet the new year with a renewed, open, and healing heart. Gamar Chatima Tova.